Joining us as we kick off the conversation in the fight for environmental equity is a woman who knows it inside and out. Dr. Beverly Wright is the executive director for the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. Dr. Wright, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, now for those who may not know or understand, what is environmental racism and what are different forms of it?
So, environmental racism from our perspective, at least when I think about where we began, was the disproportionate exposure of environmental pollutants to people of color communities. And for us, it was initially African-American communities, because that's who we were working with in what's called Cancer Alley. It was also the unequal protection that existed because of the inability to enforce laws and regulations that could, in fact, protect communities. That's the definition on its surface. But if you really want to see what environmental racism is looking at, in our own backyard, Cancer Alley, or the corporations like to call it the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor, but communities call it Cancer Alley because our cancer rates are so extremely high. We have some of the highest cancer rates in the nation. Of the top 10 cancers, Louisiana is first in 7 of the top 10 cancers. And as a survivor of breast cancer myself, during my treatment at MD Anderson, when I got to the hospital and they asked me where I was from, the nurses said, "Oh, we get a lot from down there." Now, when you're standing out at a hospital that is that huge, they are seeing so many people from Louisiana, you know that we have a problem. But even when I think about what environmental racism looked like for me in the early 90s, it was, in fact, communities living fence line to huge facilities such as Shell and Exxon. When I say fence line, I mean spitting distance from these huge pipelines that emitted cancerous emissions 24/7, low-level emissions, but through the pipes continuously. I saw communities whose window screens were rusting and falling off about every 3 months. You know, I saw communities with small white crosses on their front lawns to show the number of people in their homes who had died from cancer, the moss on the trees dying, cars riding around with circles where the paint had disappeared, in circles that looked lunar in some manner or something from outer space. And people sick and tired of being, as they say, sick and tired, vegetation only growing on the opposite side of being downwind from these facilities, and flaring at night to the point that they had to put dark curtains up because it was like daylight at late at night. And unbelievable fear, unbelievable health problems, all the small animals disappearing where they used to fish and hunt. That was, for me, environmental racism, and the fact that white people had been relocated from close proximity to these facilities while Black people were left to languish. And my center, the Deep South Center, conducted a GIS mapping, the first ever done in the corridor. And we found that 80% of African Americans live within 3 miles of a polluting facility. And it wasn't just one, it was multiple facilities. And it created a map of strange fruit. That's the way I describe it, because the map in some areas had so many facilities that you could barely see the actual community on the map. So our communities have been exposed to what we call cumulative impacts. And that is why whenever we would go to court to fight the plants and its emissions, we would lose, because the types of cancers that our communities had did not fit very neatly into the description of what emissions were being released at plants and what particular cancers it caused. So we didn't have an embryotoxin, we didn't have a neurotoxin. And the cancers that we had were not neuro or embryo, and that's what they said that their chemicals would cause. So we had been losing that battle because science had not caught up with what was going on in our communities. But that gap is being closed, and we're now able to determine something more than one chemical at a time for one disease. We now know what combinations of these things do. And I guess environmental racism also is the what I would call being disenfranchised. In other words, white communities were able to move because their politicians listened to them. When I talked to Black communities and said, well, what's that area right over across the street from you where they're just pollens on the ground? What was that? They said, oh, that's where white people used to live. And the boss told us he would be back. That was 8 years ago. So you literally had white people being better protected from pollution in the corridor than Black people. That's environmental racism as well.
Right. So the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, you know, it is a community university, communiversity model, so to say, partnership organization. What does that mean, and how does it help with environmental justice?
Okay, so the communiversity model is a model that I developed or advanced with the work that I do in the corridor, and it really evolved out of what I would call my own experiences, and that is as a college professor, working in communities and finding out that there were many questions that community people had that needed to be answered scientifically. In other words, you needed a toxicologist or you needed an epidemiologist. You needed to be able to connect with ATSCR, that's the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or the Center for Disease Control, none of which communities had, but all universities had connections to all of these things, the science plus connections to agencies. And so the idea was that you would bring communities together with researchers, but that relationship would be of equal balance so that you don't have researchers not respecting the knowledge of communities and communities, you know, not trusting researchers who often came to work with them just to get tenure. So it was a whole transformation of the relationship between communities and universities. And we started in New Orleans with Xavier University and Tulane University that has now expanded to about 32 HBCUs in 5 states, working with us on environmental justice issues in those areas. And so it was a slow rolling process for me as a researcher, teaching at the University of New Orleans, trying to find answers to questions, trying to find funding for questions, and then finally doing what sociologists are taught, ask the question. So I began asking communities, what do you see as a problem, and what do you want fixed, and how do you think we should do it? And when I did that, I finally was able to get some grants funded that actually help communities in the way that they wanted to be helped, and provide community people with resources to do the work that we wanted them to do. So in a nutshell, that's the communiversity model. And our center works from that position. Everything is bottom up. So we don't do anything that communities don't ask us to do. We don't try to answer any questions that communities don't agree with. And it's called a communiversity model.
Mm-hmm. And I know when you mentioned, you know, working with the people in those communities, you've done some work with those people to where it helps them learn about what's happening around them, but also employing them as well. Talk about that.
Yes, well, that's interesting. Everything is connected in the work that I've done for almost 30 years. And so in working with communities to attend hearings and to advocate for themselves to get emissions reduction in the corridor, communities were always very happy with the services that we presented, all the classes and connections. But I remember at one community, when we had finished fighting the battle that we were having, that one lady said to me, and her name was Miss West, and she was actually lives in St. James Parish. And she said, you know, Dr. Wright, we appreciate everything that you do, but when you leave, our community is still poor. our young people don't have any jobs, and we really need to have jobs. And so the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences just happened to recognize that they needed a program that included minorities. And we were one of the first grantees of this program that's now been in existence for 25 years, where we train young men and women in hazardous waste, lead abatement, basic construction, green construction, and we're trying to move on into renewables, so that we'll train young people to do things like solar panels and so on. And what that does is it actually allows communities who are devastated from environmental pollution, but also living in poverty, get an economic boost from working to clean up their own communities. And not only that, travel the United States, helping other communities to be clean.
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Wright, thank you for joining us, and you just shared some very good information that, of course, will help in the fight for environmental equity. Thanks again.
Thank you.